everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Savannah O'Hare, and I'm delighted that all of you are able to join us today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity. Before we get started, I just had a few housekeeping items that I wanted to go over. Today's session will be recorded and will also be available after the briefing. As you may already be aware, we're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor at the moment. Through that client, you'll be able to submit any questions at any time, and we'll make sure that we address those questions at the end of this presentation. So today, during this webinar, we'll be looking at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has collected, and highlighting what we've seen specifically during the third quarter of this year. Kroll Cyber and Data Resilience uses its frontline intelligence from thousands of IRs, regulatory response, and due diligence engagements per year, combined with our expertise in nation-state level cybersecurity, privacy and compliance, and data risks to guide clients at every stage of their journey towards resilience. We have a wealth of experience with over 700 global experts that work with companies of varying sizes and across several industries, as well as working directly with over 85 cyber insurance carriers. In this specific session, as I mentioned earlier, we're only going to cover the cyber threat landscape with a focus on Q3 of this year. Now, we are incredibly fortunate to have leading Kroll experts joining us today to go into more detail and provide their expert analysis. We are joined by Laurie, Iacono, and George Glass. Laurie, George, I'm going to pass it over to you now to introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'll start, Savannah. So my name is Laurie Iacono. I'm an Associate Managing Director for our Cyber Threat Intelligence team, and my team specifically focuses on supporting our incident response practitioners when there has been some kind of a network intrusion or compromise. And we also do a lot of dark web intelligence, either looking for customer data or looking at the latest chatter by threat actors.
Hello everyone, my name is George Glass. I'm an Associate Managing Director in the CPI team. My team, if you couldn't guess, is here in the UK, and we look at malware threats, understanding threat actor behaviour, and work to provide detections and ways of mitigating emerging threats. Thank you all very much for joining today. Back to you, Laurie.
Thanks, George. So for any of you who might be joining for the first time today, we usually start these by, kind of level setting with our methodology for these reports, because you will see in the webinar session today a lot of graphs and numbers. And all of those graphs and numbers that you'll be seeing, they are pulled from our incident response engagement. So as I mentioned, that's something that my team specifically supports. And we also support the data analysis. So kind of looking across those cases to see if there's any insights we can draw on emerging threats or trends. Now, what we do with that data, because obviously that's one piece of the puzzle, right, when it comes to the threat landscape. Now, George's team, they also have insight into what Kroll sees on the managed services side. So this would be, attempted compromises that our SOC teams may be observing. So we overlay the data that we have from our IR practice, and based on what we're seeing in managed services and then what we're seeing in the wider landscape, either from other security researcher reporting or on the dark web, we kind of reach these themes that we cover for a quarterly each time. So that just, as I said, that just kind of sets the landscape for what will, or the methodology for what we'll be covering today. So if we get into our first section here, we're really focused on, looking at the Q3 2024. One of the things that we saw that really bubbled up, and first we were seeing it kind of just open source anecdotally in some of the cases that we were seeing and some of the research that we were reading, but then we actually saw it bear out in the cases that came into us during the third quarter. And this was an increase in activity of threat actors targeting the tech and telecom sector. So you can see here, this chart, this actually looks at our top 5 sectors that we observed during the third quarter. Professional services, if you've been on these calls before, you know professional services is usually one of the most targeted sectors that we see in our casework, followed by manufacturing. Manufacturing, again, one of the top sectors, particularly when it comes to ransomware. And then after that, we have financial services. Also, this year, we've been seeing a lot of retail and restaurant. And then tech and telecom. Now, last time they didn't make the top 5 sectors for our cases, but this time they did. And you can see there was quite a jump from the previous quarter. And when we looked at, you know, the cases involving the tech sector, a lot of what we were seeing at Kroll was related to insider threat as well as email compromise. Now, if we look at the next slide here in the presentation, you can kind of see the increase that we've observed over time. So it's been kind of like a, you know, quarter over quarter increase since last year at this time. We had a little bit of downturn in Q2 and then a big jump in Q3 this year. So if we go over to our next slide here, I want to talk a little bit more. As I mentioned, you know, I already kind of mentioned some of the threat incident types that we at Kroll were observing with the tech and telecom sector. A lot of this was around insider threat and email compromise, but we also see with this sector a lot of ransomware activity as well as unauthorized access. And, you know, we always spend a lot of time in these sessions talking about ransomware. And one of the reasons for that is because of the high impact of a ransomware event that it has on an organization. And this next case study that we're going to get into, I think this one is really, really good at kind of establishing how ransomware can impact an organization. So if we follow this particular case with a through line here, this one started with a phishing email. It was a phishing email that was stealing the user's credentials. Once those credentials were obtained, they were used to log back into the system. And again, if you join these sessions a lot, you see, you probably hear that that's something we talk about a lot, valid accounts being used, phishing for initial access. So this case kind of highlighted both of those. Now, once the actors got into the system, they took some measures to try to evade, defense that was on the system. So they actually bypassed and uninstalled some of the EDR tooling that was available. Fortunately, they weren't able to do that across the whole network. There was only like an area of the network that they were able to bypass the EDR tooling. But this still, even with this like small bypass, it still allowed them to encrypt part of the network with malware. Now, this was a big global network that they had hit here. And unfortunately, once this encryption started, there were critical services that couldn't be accessed, including their public-facing website. So at this time, you know, employees couldn't access anything, so work could not continue. And then as well, for this particular case, they had a website where purchases could potentially be made, and customers couldn't access that. So every minute they were down, as that, you know, last illustration there shows, every minute they were down, they were losing money while the network was down. So this case study, we thought it was a really good one at kind of underscoring the importance of business continuity in these cases, because especially when a technology firm is hit, you know, if they lose critical functions, that could impact not just them, but also any customers that those firms may have. So let's go over to the next slide here. And I want to talk about, you know, kind of putting this in the big picture of technology firms, because this isn't the first time, right, that we've seen threat actors go after technology firms. This is a kind of an old favorite of threat actors. So we kind of have a trip down memory lane here with a timeline of some of the most notable cases involving significant technologies. And starting with Microsoft Exchange proxy logon that happened back in 2020, as well as SolarWinds was another one that happened in 2020. And I know I'm talking a lot here, so George, if there's anything you want to add on either of those cases, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the most memorable for me was probably proxy logon, just how widespread that campaign was, how huge that vulnerability was, and the type of access that it gave was sort of a perfect storm. So yeah, going all the way back sort of 4 years to 2020 now, that's a long old time ago. But we're still seeing more of these types of vulnerabilities today. Even the beginning of this year, I seem to remember as being pretty heavy for vulnerabilities. Moving through as well, Move It. That was a huge deal for us last year. There's a lot of work that Kroll did in analyzing the Move It vulnerabilities. The impact there, of course, was mostly because the technology that was being targeted because of the type of organizations that would use that technology downstream. So threat actors absolutely know that those implementations of various types of technology, in this case it was for file sharing, of course, it can have huge impact on many organizations by compromising maybe one piece of software. So yeah, it just again sort of underscores the fact that you need to be able to plan for these things, and when the worst does happen, be able to react to it properly, really.
Yeah, and some of the other notable ones that we saw were also Revel, the Kaseya supply chain attack in July of 2021. We're approaching the holiday season right now, so a lot of questions that I get from clients sometimes is, hey, what do you see, with respects to cyber threats in the holidays? And we typically see more activity, right? So SolarWinds, for a lot of people in cyber, I'm sure they remember that as happening around Christmas. And then you had, Revel, Kaseya supply chain attack happened the July 4th weekend. Now then, getting into 2022, we saw more targeting of technology firms. This was when the Lapsus group kind of went on a tear. The first 2 months of that year, they were targeting multiple different technology firms. And really what they were doing was stealing a lot of data and then putting it up, making it publicly available. So source code available, IP available, and things like that. And then more recently, one of the large attacks that we observed in 2023 was related to Move It software. So it was really a targeting of a 0-day vulnerability in that software that ended up impacting hundreds and hundreds of organizations. And George is nodding his head because he remembers, like me, working on that one quite a lot.
Yes. I don't think I'm going to be forgetting that for a long old while. As I said before, Move It is one of those pieces of software specifically chosen for targeting. It happened last year. I don't think that's the last time it's going to happen. So that's one of those really serious sort of response actions that you're going to have to take at some point. You need to be ready for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm looking at our timeline here. I think proxy logon actually happened in 2021. Because I kind of remember SolarWinds happening end of 2020, and then we got into 2021 thinking, okay, get a little bit of a break, and then you have proxy logon starting, Revel, and all of that. So 2020 and 2021 were wild years working in cyber. So if we move over to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what we were seeing in the last quarter, right? So one of the big stories, of this quarter, unfortunately, was the IT outages caused by the CrowdStrike, kind of known as the blue screen of death, that impacted organizations on July 19th. And this one was really a perfect storm for organizations. There had been an Azure outage the same evening that had come up, and about an hour or two later, faulty software update associated with CrowdStrike sent millions and millions of computers into this blue screen. And I remember waking up that morning at like 6 a.m. and I had, hundreds and hundreds of email messages. And that's when I'm glad I have a colleague like George just in the UK, because they've already been working on it for a couple hours before I woke up. But George, tell us a little bit about what you were seeing that day.
Yeah, that was a pretty incredible Friday, and a Friday of all days for it to happen as well. Again, it's sort of one of those things where it could have easily been some kind of horrendous cyber attack. But in this case, it was just a faulty update that was just happened to be pushed to millions of devices. Of course, especially on the MDR side of the house, we're immediately working on that, trying to understand exactly what happened. I remember thinking the first portion of the day, we need to stand up our response plan for if a supplier is compromised, because you just have to sort of assume that to begin with. Thankfully, CrowdStrike put out messaging that quickly sort of set the situation straight, and we knew what we were dealing with. But again, these things take a lot of work. They take a lot of people power to put them right and understand the impact. And the impact in this case was pretty large. There was a pretty significant amount of outages. I remember here in the UK, at least, TV channels being offline because of it. It has sort of all of the hallmarks of a cyber attack. There's outages on the machines. I think we're just lucky in this case that it wasn't longer than it was, and the impact wasn't as severe as it would have been if it was some kind of cybercrime or nation state attack. So really, really interesting weekend, really long weekend.
Yeah, I think we were on the phone about all day that day. One of the things that really highlighted, though, was how dependent we all are on technology firms, right? So like even if we're not working at a technology firm, we're relying on technology to underpin, everything that we're doing. So it really highlighted that importance of business continuity planning for organizations. And I think this was something that we heard a lot from our clients in the weeks and months following that incident. And again, we were just lucky in that case that it wasn't some, malicious cyber attack, but it was kind of a way to highlight that interconnectedness across organizations. Now, a bit more of what we were seeing related to the technology sector in Q3, I want to touch on two different things. The first thing here, we talk about there was a lot of nation state activity this past year, if you've been following cyber news. And one of the campaigns that has been reported on quite a lot is the idea of nation state actors, particularly associated with North Korea, really impersonating IT employees or IT workers and attempting to infiltrate organizations. And there's been a lot of reporting on this on the last year. Now, if you joined the Q1 briefing that we did earlier this year, you'll know that we reported on a case that had a very similar fact pattern to that. At that time, a lot of the reporting on this wasn't available. And unfortunately, in that particular case, we didn't have a lot of logs to go on to kind of make some of these conclusions. But looking back, it's very likely that employee impersonation case that we looked at in the first quarter was associated with this type of activity. And you could see that, one of the things that they were targeting there was the sensitive source code related to the organization. There were also multiple reports with Chinese-based threat actors in Q3. One of them was impacting the tech and telecom sector. This was a group that Microsoft is calling Salt Typhoon, but they had gained access to multiple U.S. telecommunications firms and internet service providers. And that one highlights another interesting thing when it comes to tech and telecom cases, because a lot of times the tech and telecom, it's not really the main target. Essentially, it's the target. It's where they get their foot in the door. But a lot of times the targets are those, the users on the end of the line. Particularly in that case with Salt Typhoon, particularly it was kind of targeting government organizations and surveilling those phone calls. Now, let's move on to our next section here. I want to get into a little bit about what we were seeing with the ransomware landscape. And as I said, we always touch on this a lot because it does have a high impact to organizations when a ransomware event happens. So looking in Q3, first of all, we're going to look at kind of like all the threat incident types, or the top threat incident types that we saw in the quarter. And in Q3, we kind of saw, email compromise followed by insider threat, ransomware, and unauthorized access were the most common threat incident types that we were seeing. And if we move over to the next slide here, I want to look a little bit at Yeah, and that one just showed like quarter over quarter. But I want to talk a little bit about the groups that we observed in Q3, because in Q1 and Q2 of this year, there was a lot of activity in the ransomware landscape. We had really big groups like Black Hat, kind of shutting down. We had disruption to Lockbit. And I know when we were going over this particular chart, George said, hey, I think things looked a lot different last year. And when I looked it up, it's basically like almost 50% of our ransomware cases in Q3 last year were either Lockbit or Black Hat. So those groups were very, very active last year. And now we see, Black Hat has completely fallen off the map, and we see Lockbit to a much lesser degree. We did see a lot of activity in Q3 when it came to the group Akira. Last year, we had reported on them targeting Cisco ASA VPN. This time around, they were targeting SonicWall VPN. So we had a lot of cases there. And as is usually the case, after we have significant disruption, we start seeing new groups emerge. And we're still kind of in that holding pattern quarter where we're waiting to see like what group will come to be the most dominant one. But some of the ones that we observed in Q3 were Lynx was one that we saw a lot of, another one called Cicada. We were also seeing one called Termite. Is another new one, and they recently posted a leak site. So we've kind of been seeing some of the new groups in the ransomware landscape. Now, if we go over to the next slide, I want to look, this one is just showing by industry. So again, bringing it back to the theme of the targeting of technology, you can see in 2024, the technology sector accounts for the most number of postings on ransomware leak sites. And then if we move to the next slide, we're going to talk about information stealers. And as I said before, valid accounts, I know we always talk about that on the quarterly, but that's because it's still a problem. And in fact, in this quarter, it accounted for about 35% of our initial access methods that we observed. So it's right up there, neck and neck with phishing this time. So I'm going to let George kind of take the wheel here, and he's going to take us through a pretty big deep dive into what they've been seeing with info stealers.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, this quarter has been pretty much info stealers as far as the eye can see. And we've been doing this a pretty long time now. And even thinking back to sort of the days of Emotet, sort of email-based malware, very easy to deploy, VBA macros and all of those sorts of things. I don't think I've seen anything quite like what I've been seeing over the last few months in terms of the same campaigns appearing across multiple different industries, multiple different sectors, different levels of sophistication of the clients that are affected by these things. And it's really been a huge surprise, and that's reflected here in our intelligence collection for malware. So just to be clear again, if this is the first time you're joining one of these webinars, we collect both from internal and external, and we sort of aggregate that data to see sort of what are the most active malwares around right now. And this is what we're seeing. We can see Luma Stealer there. That's raced straight to number one on our list. We've also got Steal C. Remcos Rat also has information stealing capabilities, but that's really rocketed up the leaderboards here. We've got Redline Stealer. That's typically in the top 10, but just recently in Q4, there's been some disruption to Redline Stealer with Operation Magnus. You'll have to tune in next time to see the outcome of that, I think. Amadei as well, that's also got information stealing capabilities. And then we can see sort of the Cobalt Strikes, the Metasploits, the Slivers, the second stage sort of implants that you typically see following, sort of a Pika-bot or some other loading malware. Those are going down the list again. So I think what we're really seeing here is if we sort of consider the amount of valid accounts that we're seeing being abused, the amount of times that some sort of external remote service is being used as sort of the initial access point. I think we can tie all of this together and say that the information stealers have been very successful in what they're doing. And I just wanted to take some time to sort of go through how these work, because I think it's really important to understand what these information stealers are trying to obtain. Traditionally, these sorts of stealers are used sort of on a personal computer, really. They're designed to steal banking information. Lots of them are very specialized and adept at stealing cryptocurrency information. And of course, yeah, that works. That works really, really well. But if you want a really big payout, then, why not browse through some of these stealer logs and try and find enterprise credentials? They're certainly going to be there, right? And what we see here is sort of this is not an exhaustive list, by the way, but you can see here, this is the list of things that an information stealing malware would typically go for. We've highlighted some of these in green that we think are sort of the most important. And we've spoken about it before, but it remains true. Session tokens and cookies are a really, really easy way for threat actors to sort of impersonate someone. Many of those session tokens, they're still living for a long time. They're sort of 90 days without needing sort of a re-authentication. And as long as the bad guys can sort of not trigger a impossible travel alarm or something like that, which we'll get into later, this is a very effective way of bypassing MFA as well. All of that is sort of compounded by the fact that they're taking screenshots, they're key logging, and there's a number of different ways that these stealers are sort of improving. There's a really quite interesting underground market on how these stealers work and operate. Many of them sort of steal features from each other, and they're almost sort of in an arms race to deploy new capabilities. So let's have a look at how the tactics, techniques, and procedures for these things work. So as I mentioned before, information stealers can be used to target individuals at home and in the enterprise. And users tend to reuse their passwords in lots of different places. They may log in from their home device as a sort of a BYOD device. So credentials for enterprise accounts may well be stored on a personal computer. That's of course outside of the enterprise environment, probably not protected by EDR or antivirus or something like that. What we're seeing is that most of these campaigns are using sort of SEO poisoning, social engineering attacks, malicious advertising, something along those lines, which we'll get into a second, to install the malware. The threat actors are harvesting that information, they're running off, and they're going to sell that information on the deep and dark web. And yes, we look at those logs and we collect them, and we sort of do analysis on whether a client's information is in there. And of course, there's often quite a few hits on those post ransomware engagement, and that could be a likely way that the threat actor got in. So this year has seen a lot of changes in the way that information stealing malware works, mostly on the delivery side of things. So earlier this year, I think we've got a screenshot here. We released some analysis on this, and this is an example from a couple of different web pages here on YouTube, purporting to sell or not sell, offer Sony Vegas Pro for free. This is classic, right? It even says there in the description, I think, make sure that you disable or remove your antivirus because the files are completely clean. Well, I can tell you right now they're not, and that was leading to information stealing malware. These videos sort of live for maybe a day, 2 days, but then they were quickly taken down by YouTube. So then we started to see a movement away from those sorts of techniques to more clever things like this. This is what is being referred to as click fix, I think, in the sort of the cybersecurity research sphere. We believe at Kroll that this was based on an attack that was sent via phishing by who we refer to as KTA248, and that actor was delivering these sort of manually. Essentially, these work by just really clever social engineering. There's no sort of vulnerability that's being exploited here. You can read for yourself. All they're asking you to do is to hit your start button, open PowerShell, and copy and paste the malicious code directly into your PowerShell window. There's even video instructions on how to do it. And this is incredibly effective because people aren't trained to spot things like this. It looks very convincing. You browse to a website, you see this pop up, and you go, whoa, there's something wrong with my Chrome, I better fix it. And here's a handy way on how to do so. It's not typically covered in cybersecurity training or anything like that. And these work very, very well, let me tell you. Lots and lots of people are falling for this. We then started to see sort of in September time, the final form, the thing that we're seeing the most right now, which is sort of, again, another play on a security mechanism, and that is captures. And this is even simpler. It's a fake capture, again, on sort of a SEO poison web page, maybe a link in a forum, an ad somewhere. And it's you know, again, it's something that isn't covered in cybersecurity training. Do you know what a capture looks like? Do you know how it's supposed to work? Usually you just click on something and you have to solve a puzzle or something like that. Well, in this particular case, it is exactly the same as the click fix one. Open up your PowerShell console, or in this case, just Windows R, paste the malicious command and hit enter, and that will download and install. In this case, we saw a lot of LumaStealer infections. So if we move on to the next step here, that installation has happened. LumaStealer has executed, and it's going to steal all of these things from your machine. All of these things are really useful in emulating a particular person. The information stealer will gather information on where you are geographically, all of the cookies, login tokens I mentioned before. It can rifle through password managers if they're unlocked. It'll grab banking information, interesting files. It'll go through chat messages, look in there for interesting strings, maybe API keys, things like that. And we do see these as part of ransomware engagements as well. If the threat actor needs to get hold of some credentials quite quickly on an endpoint, they may just drop this information stealing malware and collect it that way. It's a perfectly adequate tool for that. But more often than not, what ends up happening is all of this information is sold on the deep and dark web. And actually, in plain sight as well, I must say, you can go to Telegram, for example. This is an example of a posting on Telegram, and you can use a bot to buy the stolen credentials, and you can see there the list of domains that there could be cookies that are still valid for. So just picking a couple of these out, I can see a PayPal account in there, a Login Live account, a Google.com account. All of those could be very, very valuable places to sort of go hunting for more interesting information, maybe access to a corporate environment. And that's all available for the low price of $1, which is fairly scary. There are other threat actors that specialize in parsing the logs. So this is an example of a folder structure from a machine that's been infected with a stealer. These actors will filter through the logs and understand how useful the data is, and then they'll hike the price up depending on how interesting they think it is. At the bottom of that screenshot there, you can see that there's a working login, a working password, and a cookie for Microsoft.com and Outlook.com. And more often than not, this is going to be used as a way to attack an enterprise environment. Maybe it's for business email compromise. Maybe it's a valid remote desktop. All of those things might be used in that way to attack a corporate environment. And finally, just to round this section off here, those that don't get sold get sort of bundled up together. So we've seen a couple of these recently. This one is 2 gigabytes in size of crypto wallets, access to PayPal, bank, all the sorts of things that could potentially get threat actors some money. And they're, again, just sold in bulk like this. So that's all well and good. They've sold their information, but what happens if a threat actor that knows what they're doing and is intent on causing harm to a corporate environment, what do they do when they get this information? Well, in the case of token theft, really, all they need to do is take that token, put it into their machine, and then they can essentially become that user. Now, there's a bit of nuance here, of course, but this is just to sort of prove a point here that it is possible. Stealing those tokens and having those access tokens live for such a long time gives the threat actor the ability to log into an environment, and then they can do pretty much whatever they want, be that initial access for ransomware, data theft, espionage, conducting business email compromise, fraud, and all of those sorts of things. And I really feel like that's what we are seeing in a lot of our casework right now, is the fact that threat actors have cottoned on to the fact that all of these credentials are out there, they're available, some of these tokens live for a long, long time, and they're a very valuable way, a very easy way of making initial access into a corporate environment. So that's rounding up. Oh, sorry, Laurie, you go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, George, I was just going to add on, like, I mentioned earlier, like my team does dark web lookups. So like when we do exposure assessments for clients, I mean, just the sheer volume of how many of these postings are out there is shocking. I think almost like every client, when they come to us, they're going to have at least one match. And usually they're going to be in those credential markets, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall we move on to some mitigative actions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that last point was like really good because, okay, they stole some credentials, like what's the impact of that? But then as you had, there's a lot of impact there because there's data theft, there's ransomware, there's, unauthorized access in the system. And any one of those things could cause a situation where critical functions stopped, where a network was encrypted, where business continuity was interrupted. So that's why we're really highlighting, that for our, for our webinar this time. So some of the things, that we recommend that organizations do to help out with that, we always kind of say sometimes in the industry, it's not if, but it's when something like this happens. So it's really, really important to prioritize planning for these type of events. You don't want to be the company that's thinking it can't happen to us because, as we see every day in the clients that come to us, it can really happen to anybody. So, along with that, it's incident response planning is enough, but also, regular testing, vulnerability assessments, kind of making sure that the planning you're doing is working. Tabletop exercises are, a great way to do that. That's definitely something that we help our clients with because, you may not even realize maybe, small gaps that you have in procedures or operations that could cost you money when it came to having a live incident like this.
Yeah, and having a cyber risk retainer in place so that should something go wrong, you can act quickly. As we were saying before, a lot of these things can escalate very, very quickly. And so it's important to be able to mobilize the most capable people possible to deal with that incident. And that also goes hand in hand with having controls in place. The controls may not always stop a cyber attack. They can slow one down. So the capability to be able to maybe reroute areas of the network, isolate specific machines, things like that can certainly slow things down. And those controls that you put in place last year, maybe they need to be updated this year in response to the new threats that are emerging, and for example, reducing the time to live for some of those tokens. And finally, looking at the external attack surface of a business and how those continuity plans can play into that, I think is also really, really important to ensure you're checking that at the very least once a year. So let's move to the summary now and get some closing thoughts. What are we focused on today? Well, we know that tech and telecoms is still a very targeted sector. This is a global pattern. We're seeing it. Other organizations are seeing it as well. Professional services, still a very highly targeted sector as well. Again, they provide services to many different companies, and that makes them just a valid target as tech and telecom as well. And we've seen a large amount of nation-state activity this year. It's been highly publicized. There's been a lot of sort of law enforcement alerting about it as well, and we've seen it ourselves also. Laurie, I'll hand over to you for the last two.
Yeah, and then just with the ransomware groups, like we said, like a lot of what we're seeing right now could be kind of like a rebuilding of that particular ecosphere. One thing that happened in Q3, I think that was interesting. I know George talked about nation state activities. There was a report that came out in Q3 about Iranian nation state actors actually kind of participating in that initial access broker activity. And you would, typically we would kind of think of that to be, kind of like Eastern European forums, Russian language forums where that's taking place. And those are the only actors that are kind of benefiting from that landscape. But this showed that there's actually, other countries are seeing, the payout that you can get from this kind of activity, and they're trying to get a piece of it as well. So it's just a constant evolution with that. But like I said, even though, ransomware and nation state, those are the ones that tend to get more of the headlines. But we still see that things like business email compromise and insider threat, those are still, a key area of risk for businesses. So also important to, have plans and controls around those as well. So this is kind of like we're coming up on the end of the presentation here. So we'll take any questions that people may have, in the chat. If you have one now, feel free to type it in. I did see one that came in during the session around asking about, have we observed an increase in phishing attempts at banks and financial institutions, and kind of looking at some of our data. I don't think based on our data that we'd really seen anything that was statistically significant in saying that there's a large increase in that activity, but we continue to see high activity with phishing attempts at financial institutions. And, typically, like I mentioned earlier, there are things that happen during the holiday seasons, right? So sometimes we do see an uptick in this kind of activity during the holiday season that we're getting into now.
Any more questions from anyone? Now's the time. Alrighty, well, if there are no more questions coming in on the chat, I'm still looking, but just in case, just want to say a big thank you to everyone that's taken the time to tune in. We really hope that you found the session informative. We have now published the Q3 2024 Threat Landscape Report on the Kroll website, and that's where you can read even more details on the trends we've outlined today. If you liked this webinar, there is also a condensed weekly version. The Kroll CTI team discussed current trends in our weekly briefing entitled In the Trenches, which is published on LinkedIn. So make sure you catch that if you'd like to hear more from our CTI team on a more weekly basis. When you leave the briefing, you will be directed to a short survey. If you could just spare a few moments, we'd really appreciate it. If you could just tell us what your thoughts on the session were. It really helps us prepare for next time, make sure we're delivering all the right content that you guys are interested in. And once again, thanks a lot for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.